So they're literally draining the blood out of little kids just a few miles from the DNC. You might not believe me. You might remember the Pizzagate conspiracy from 2016, where people falsely believed that Hillary Clinton and a bunch of Democrats were engaged in satanic rituals with little kids, sacrificing them to the gods at a pizza shop in DC. But this is a real satanic conspiracy. And the reason I know this is because I've seen it. So just a few miles from the United Center where the Democratic National Convention was held, there is a place where young children are rounded into pens. They are terrified. They've been taken from their mothers. They have their throats slit. They're hooked and hoisted onto a line, and the blood is let out of their bodies so people can consume them. And as you might guess, this place is a slaughterhouse. In fact, it's the last remaining slaughterhouse in the Chicago stockyards. It's a place that I first visited back in 2007. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. And I had been through a lot of terrifying experiences at that point in my life. I had my face sliced open when I was a kid by someone who put a knife into my mouth. I had been beaten up more times than I can remember. I'd been on the brink of death. There was a moment when I was a law professor at Northwestern, a failed law professor, where I was moments away from throwing myself off the top of a building because I was in such terrible mental condition. And yet walking to that slaughterhouse was by far the scariest thing I'd ever seen. And there's something really odd about a slaughterhouse. It's not just about the things you see and hear. It's about the things you smell and even feel. So remember, it's in the back of Chippetti Lamb, there are these stockyards. You could just walk in, and I just drove up in the middle of the night, walked in, and you see obviously these hordes of living animals. In this case, baby sheep and baby cows huddling in the corners of these pens. They know what's going to happen to them because they can smell the death. They've probably seen other animals being dragged off to slaughter, and they know what's coming for them too. You hear them crying sometimes. Lambs in particular will cry when they're terrified on occasion. They're usually fairly silent, but you'd hear one bleat every now and then in fear, maybe asking for her mom, wherever her mom went. But the thing that's most striking about a slaughterhouse that makes it a genuinely satanic place, a place filled with terror and fear, is the fact that when you are around other living animals experiencing utter terror, you feel terror as well. I swear to God, it's almost like some sort of psychological osmosis. It might be related to pheromones, something you can smell, subconsciously feel. But when you're around that many beings who are scared, who are so terrified, they're willing to frankly hurt themselves in order to escape the fate that they're in. And that happens all the time in slaughterhouses. You can feel it. So the only way I can compare the experience of being in a slaughterhouse where animals are on the brink of having their throats slit is if you've ever been some sort of natural disaster and God forbid some sort of violent school shooting or mass shooting event, or even just a stampede where everyone's running. When you see animals running, when you see human beings running, when you see them all shuddering in terror, there's something very primitive in our psychology and even our neurology that changes, that affects us in a very deep and primitive way. And that's what I felt when I walked in the slaughterhouse. And the thing that's most disturbing to me is, like a lot of you, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about politics. I've read a lot of articles about what's going on in the presidential election and local elections, ballot initiatives in Denver and Portland and Sonoma County. And in all this political conversation in, 4 or 5 days, the Democratic National Convention at the United Center, which is just a few miles away from this place, where little babies are experiencing a fear and terror so intense that when you walk in, you can feel it on your skin. There was not a word said about what happens inside this slaughterhouse or in slaughterhouses across the nation. So at the DNC, they had plenty of time to talk about a lot of other things. They talked about Kamala Harris and her coconut trees. I don't know what the hell that's about, but maybe you do. There's some discussion before the DNC about whether vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance likes to have sex with couches. And of all people, President Barack Obama had time to talk about the size of Donald Trump's crowds, except he was going like this. And You can kind of guess what he was trying to. You can guess what he was trying to measure out, or maybe you can't. But if you can't, then good for you. You have a very innocent mind. They had time to talk about all these inanities, all these things that don't matter at all, and yet they didn't have time to spend even a word on the fact that we're living in a period of time in Earth's history where more living creatures are being intentionally tortured and slaughtered. Creatures no different than the dogs and cats we love in our own homes than at any point in the planet's history. And for the record, this is a bipartisan problem. Well, I've given a lot of crap to Joe Biden, for example, for saying that the public has no legitimate interest in the fact that mother pigs are confined in living tombs, gestation crates where the mother pig is trapped so tightly that she cannot even stand up or turn around or turn to look at her own babies in her eyes when she's trapped in a farrowing crate. I've talked about how Democrats, just like Republicans, love handing out massive multi-billion-dollar subsidies to some of the biggest agricultural corporations in the world. But the reality is, in many ways, the Republicans are even worse. So, for example, Republicans love to go after Biden and Kamala and the rest of the Democrats for trying to take away their meat, right? Do you remember back in the Green New Deal, the obsession over cow farts, how they want to take our burgers away because they're scared of cow farts? Now, granted, cow farts are actually not the problem. It's actually cow burps, and cow burps actually are a problem. But the right has obviously had a moral panic about the prospect of someone taking their burgers away, and I don't know why. It's completely absurd. But it's a problem on the right. And Donald Trump, for the record, not only has his own line of burgers that he sells, but his kid literally is hunted down endangered animals. Who hunts endangered animals? Well, Donald Trump Jr. does. He went to Mongolia and decided to go kill an endangered ram just for the hell of it. I'll also say, if you look at kind of the record of Donald Trump, while the Democrats and Republicans are both terrible in terms of supporting big ag, subsidizing them, helping maintain their monopolies, Donald Trump did something so vile and evil that it's hard to believe it even happened, which is he indemnified, basically subsidized and insured all these big factory farms and slaughterhouses because all the slaughterhouses were shutting down during COVID-19, they decided to just roast all the animals alive. They said, we can't get rid of these animals in a slaughterhouse. We don't want to feed them. We're getting too big because, again, all the animals in these slaughterhouses are babies. Pigs are killed at 6 months. Lambs are killed at around 6 months. Chickens are killed at 6 weeks. So instead of trying to find a place where these animals could go, instead of even humanely euthanizing them, as awful and euphemistic as that is, Trump actually indemnified and supported big ag in literally closing the vents in the factory farms, pumping in hot steam and roasting all the animals alive. So yes, it is a bipartisan problem. But the question I want to try to answer, and that I started this with, is, the title of this YouTube show and podcast that I'm thinking about using is The DNC's Real Satanic Conspiracy. And it's satanic because it's almost like there's a god of evil we're sacrificing all these animals to, because we're not doing it for any good purpose. It's hurting our health, it's hurting the economy, it's hurting the environment, it's hurting the animals themselves. It's also a conspiracy in the sense that there's a group of people conspiring together to ensure these satanic rituals where juvenile baby animals are being tortured and slaughtered and scalded alive and roasted alive. It's all being ignored. It's all being covered up. So why do I call it a conspiracy? And what's causing this massive moral crisis? Andy Greenberg, a journalist at Wired, pointed out that the average lived experience of a living creature on the planet Earth today is the life of a factory farmed animal in a cage. So when that is the case, why is it that so few people know what's going on and so few politicians are talking about the issue? And I want to try to answer that question briefly, and you'll be surprised by the answer. Because the first thing I often hear is, well, maybe there's just not enough public support, Maybe it's not that surprising that we don't talk about these things because politicians are responsive to the public, and the public just doesn't care about animals, right? People aren't willing to click on animal stories. They don't want to listen to speeches about animal rights issues. They're not going to vote for politicians. I would say my personal experience is so that's not the case, partly because I actually was an attempted politician, a very badly attempted politician, but attempted politician back in 2020. I ran for mayor in Berkeley in 2020 on a platform of making the city plant-based in 10 years. And I got second, 23% of the vote. There were thousands upon thousands of people who voted for me who are not vegan or vegetarian because I got 23%. There aren't 23% vegans or vegetarians in the city of Berkeley. And you might say, well, that was kind of a unique circumstance, unusual, or maybe you might think I have some unique skills. That's definitely not true. If I have a unique skill, it's being an idiot. That's what my mom used to say. No, I do have some skills, but I don't think that's the reason people supported me. The reason people supported me by the thousands, even though I was running against an incumbent Democrat, even though I had much less money and no one knew who the hell I was, is that it turns out the vast majority of Americans don't like animal cruelty, including cruelty against farm animals. In fact, 80% of Americans in a poll by Data for Progress, 80% of Americans said that, and this is a nationally representative poll, said that farm animal cruelty is a personal moral concern. And the difference between Republicans and Democrats was trivial. Republicans, I think, were at 77% and Democrats were at 83%. So the truth is, people are horrified by animal cruelty. Which was one of the reasons the message of turning Berkeley entirely plant-based was much more powerful and successful than a lot of people might have thought. But you might ask, well, that 80%, that doesn't show depth of concern, right? There's a lot of issues that people may agree with. It doesn't mean they're going to vote or mobilize or they really care that much about it. So, 99% of people probably think that keyboards are useful. Doesn't mean that the useful keyboard movement is going to be very powerful or promoting more keyboards in the United States. I don't know, maybe it's not 99%. Is there somebody out there who thinks they're not useful? I'm sorry if you're one of the people who thinks they're not useful. But I would guess it's higher than 80% of Americans think that keyboards on computers and laptops are relatively useful. I just pulled that out of my ass. Am I allowed to curse? I'm going to do it anyways. So anyways, 99% polls estimate that 99, that's a little too exact. I don't know exactly what percentage. The point is, but the intensity of that support, they don't care that much. Putting a keyboard on every table in the nation isn't the biggest deal because, first of all, there are already a lot of keyboards. And second, it just doesn't seem like the biggest deal, So maybe it's the same with animal rights and farm animal cruelty. That 80% of Americans say farm animal cruelty is a personal moral concern, but it's a very small concern. And I think this is wrong as well. And the evidence behind this is if you look at people's responses to cruelty of various sorts, cruelty to people of color, to women, to LGBT folks, even to human children, and compare it to animals, the data actually suggests that cruelty to animals is massively more painful for people to experience. They do not like seeing it. They don't like imagining it. The reason everyone averts their eyes when they look at slaughterhouse footage is because the cruelty really bothers them. They have extremely intense opposition to animal cruelty to the point they won't even look at it. They won't want to talk about it. They don't want to see it. They hate it so much. And you can see examples like Kristi Noem, the vice presidential potential candidate who's in the running of Donald Trump, until a story came out about the fact that she shot her dog and she shot a goat, interestingly. And people talked almost as much about the goat being shot as the dog, and both of them were awful actions. But the goat was a farm animal. The dog is a more traditional companion animal. And in both cases, Twitter and Instagram and all the social media platforms, even the New York Times had so many stories about Kristi Noem shooting her dog and her goat. It must have been like a dozen stories that I read. And the New York Times is just one of hundreds of periodicals that I wrote about Kristi Noem and the fact that she shot her dog. If you don't know the story, basically she adopted, or maybe she bought this dog, but the dog's name was Cricket. The dog was apparently supposed to be a hunting dog, but was not serving as a very effective hunting dog. And one day the dog ran over to the neighbor's yard, killed a bunch of chickens. Kristi Noem got really upset, so dragged the dog to a gravel pit and shot the dog in the face. And she bragged about it in a recent book. And everybody, including everyone on Fox News, even Republicans, even Donald Trump himself, basically said, and Donald Trump's not very nice person. He's not exactly the most compassionate human being. And even Donald Trump himself said, that seemed kind of cruel. When Donald Trump thinks you're an asshole, you know you're an asshole. And Kristi Noem was called basically an asshole by Donald Trump because she hurt animals. So if it's not lack of public support, maybe it's the amount of money. I just told you about the fact that, Donald Trump was basically giving handouts to some of the largest agricultural corporations in the world, right? So maybe it's money in politics because Smithfield and Tyson and all these companies that benefited during the pandemic from government subsidies, that benefit every year from tens of billions of dollars in subsidies, crop insurance programs that allow them to get feed for basically free, commodity indemnification programs that when you and our business fails, if I start making keyboards, for example, and I can't sell them or I can't sell them at the price that I'd like to sell them, my business closes. I go bankrupt and I lose money and I have to basically go to the government and beg for food stamps and, tax credits and all the things that low-income or unemployed Americans get. In contrast, when big ag does shitty business and sells their products or doesn't sell their products or sells their products at a price that's too low to sustain their business, guess what they do? They just go to the government. The government gives them money. They indemnify them for all their losses, right? So there's a revolving door. There's a huge amount of money in politics. And there's some truth to this. Very few people know that big ag and the food sector in general contributes about as much in lobbying expensive and donations as big oil. We all know about big oil and the fossil fuel industry. Very few people know that big ag is and the agriculture industry is contributing about as much to the political system. But when you look more deeply, you realize that can't be it either, because when you look at agriculture, for example, so 100 years ago, this country was an agricultural country. Our economy was an agricultural economy, right? The statistic I always share is that in the year 1900, 1/2 of Americans lived on a farm. Half of us. I don't know anybody who lives on a farm other than a farm sanctuary. Now, granted, I'm San Francisco liberal, so not that surprising that I don't know people who live on farms. But increasingly, it's not just me. Most Americans do not know anyone who lives on a farm because agriculture is only 0.7% of the entire U.S. economy in 2023. That's about $203 billion, 0.7%. And a significant part of that revenue, of that economic product, is actually just straight up subsidies. Probably 10, 20% of agriculture's entire footprint on GDP is just from taxpayer dollars being fed into big ag corporations. But even if ag donated every single cent, and animal ag is just some portion of all of ag. Granted, it's a very large portion because even the plant-based agriculture like corn and wheat and soybeans, a lot of that goes to farm animals. But even if agriculture donated every single penny of all the money it generates, and this is in every state in the nation, every company in every sector of agriculture, even if they donated every single penny they have, it would be less money than Elon Musk himself. One guy is worth $250 billion, right? And so I don't think it's money. I think that, agriculture's immunity from any sort of criticism or complaints or even attention doesn't have to do with money, because after all, Elon Musk would love it if no one criticized him, if no one bothered with Twitter and SpaceX and Neuralink and all the vile and evil things, and some good things too. I don't have a problem with Tesla, maybe a little problem with Tesla, but Elon Musk does all these evil things, and he has way more money than ag, even just him alone, not even counting for his companies. Like, his companies are multi-trillion-dollar companies, but the guy alone is worth $250 billion. And if he could donate money to stop criticism, he'd love to do it, but he can't, because $250 billion isn't enough. An economy as large as ours, $250 billion, again, is 1% of all GDP. It's not enough to corrupt politics. So I don't think it's money in politics. So what is the real reason? What is the real reason that the satanic conspiracy the literal torture and slaughter and the boiling alive and the roasting alive of so many billions of animals is covered up and ignored by a political system. Well, there's a 2-word answer that is going to surprise you. Not just because the 2 words are social science jargon that I'm going to introduce you to. And you might have heard this from me before. If you read my Substack, which if you don't, why don't you? But the 2-word answer is surprising, not just because it's social science jargon, but because it shows that the people behind the conspiracy, the people conspiring to make sure this issue is ignored and covered up, are you and me. And the 2 words are preference falsification. So what is preference falsification? How does it explain the real satanic conspiracy? Well, preference falsification is a sociological phenomenon whereby people who believe something about the world falsify their beliefs publicly. In other words, they lie to the people around them. And it doesn't have to be a malicious lie. It's kind of a little white lie, right? And an example that one of my former mentors, Cass Sunstein, gives is during the gay rights movement, there were a huge number of LGBT people who falsified their preferences with respect to gay rights. In fact, they didn't even let anyone know they were gay because it was scary to be out and open as a gay rights supporter, much less someone who's gay. And Cass writes about gay rights because he has a personal example. And Cass, for those of you who don't know Cass Sunstein, he is literally the most cited law professor on the face of the planet Earth. I think he might be the most cited law professor ever. And I co-authored a paper with him many years ago, much to his shame, called Climate Change and Animals, about how we need to care more about animals in assessing the impacts of climate change. But Cass, when he's written about preference falsification, he often uses the personal anecdote, and the personal anecdote or story that shows how he himself falsifies his preferences is animal rights. So Cass wrote a piece in the New Statesman recently where he talks about, and again, this is a very legendary, powerful person. Not only is he a law professor, but he's good friends of Barack Obama. He was actually the head of a little-known federal agency called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, which is essentially a one-person Supreme Court for the regulatory state. And for those who don't know, regulatory law is actually much more significant than statutory or case law. And a one-person Supreme Court for the entire regulatory state, for the EPA, the USDA, all these different agencies is incredibly powerful. And when he was appointed to be head of OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, the thing that people started mocking him about, teasing him about, criticizing and condemning him about was the fact that he supports animal rights. So on Fox News, they joked about how Cass wants to take the mousetraps away. People over the country laughed and mocked him for saying that he thought hunting was killing, even though hunting is literally killing. That's what it is. You are killing animals. And he writes about how it was one of the most difficult experiences of his life, and it scared him to talk about his animal rights beliefs. And that's really problematic on a lot of levels. On a personal level, it's problematic because Cass had a huge impact on me. I was already an animal rights supporter and a vegan when I went to law school, but it never occurred to me that you could be out and open and make a career, a life, a profession out of animal rights, that people who are serious thinkers thought about animal rights. I thought it was just this thing that I believed in. I was like a weird vegan. It was just a little sentimental, a little too obsessed with animals. In one of my first lectures in law school, Cass Sunstein walks in to the class, or I think it was actually a lecture at lunchtime. So lunchtime lecture. He walks in his suit, his glasses, his very intellectual, academic voice, and sits up on the table, pulls up one of his feet, and says, "These shoes aren't leather. And the reason is animals matter." And he went on to give a lecture about how Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill, a lot of ancient Greek philosophers, a lot of ancient philosophers from every tradition, whether it's Hinduism, Buddhism, even Christianity and Judaism, have concluded that animals have feelings, that animals are deserving of moral consideration, and that what we do to animals is therefore an atrocity. Because if you think animals are even worth 1/1000th, 1/10,000th of the moral weight of a human being, then suddenly what happens to animals is one of the greatest atrocities in history. And the fact that such a distinguished law professor was speaking about this openly, publicly, proudly, was very powerful for me. It's one of the reasons I ended up devoting my life to animal rights. But just a few years later, when Cass started moving a little more publicly and politically in his animal rights views, he got scared. And so he stopped talking about animal rights. And you can read his piece in the New Statesman about this. But for most of the last 20 or so years since I co-authored a piece of Cass Sunstein in 2006 about animals, he's barely even said a word about animal rights. And Cass isn't the only one. So Ezra Klein, one of the most powerful journalists in the nation. I mean, I think you can make a case that Ezra Klein at the New York Times is the reason Joe Biden is out of the job, or not out of the job. I mean, he's still in the job. He's still president as far as we know. Although there's some conspiracy theories that they've hidden Joe Biden away and that he's actually not president. They just have a doll or, some sort of guy in a costume pretending to be Joe Biden. But I don't believe that. I hope you don't either. But Ezra Klein is an incredibly influential journalist who was one of the first people to call for Joe Biden to step down from the election, and did a lot of the interviews and reporting and writing that caused Biden to step down. He is a columnist at the most important newspaper in the nation. He has a podcast that is among the most listened to political podcasts in the nation. And yet there's something Ezra Klein has admitted he's very scared about. And that is talking openly about animal rights. He's scared. You can listen to a podcast he did called The Green Pill. This podcast actually used to be called The Green Pill. I borrowed it with consent. I asked Ezra if I could use the green pill concept for the podcast. But the idea behind the green pill is that, I don't know the Matrix movie very well, but from my understanding, in the Matrix, there's two pills that are offered to someone, and they can take, I think it's the blue pill, and be delusional and live in a fake and simulated and manipulated utopia. Or they can take the red pill, or in Ezra's version of this, the green pill, and see the world the way it is. And what Ezra has said and written about is that when he took the green pill and realized that animal suffering matters and animal suffering is everywhere, it almost broke him. Everywhere he looked, everything looked different. The food in the grocery store suddenly appears to be murder victims on every counter. The meals they used to enjoy with their friends and family suddenly feel like graveyards for innocent beings. Even when you look outside of the streets, I'm in San Francisco right now, and you see all the trees that have been cut down, all the concrete that has been paved in their place, you start thinking about a form of violent imperialism. The fact that there was a time when all of these spaces on Earth were ecosystems and homes for families, just like ours in very important ways. But we forced all these families to leave. We exterminated them. We wiped out all their children. And it's a scary thing to think about, but it's an even scarier thing to talk about openly, because if you say that animal suffering matters, then suddenly we're living in the Holocaust of holocausts. It's as if we have 6 million Holocausts every single year at every single moment, over and over again, and no one's even talking about it. That's a scary thing to say, and it's a scary thing to think. And so Ezra has written and spoken about how terrified he was to even do a podcast about the green pill, to do a podcast about animal suffering. And I was lucky enough to be on his podcast once as well. It was a terrible podcast because it was me. No, I actually think I haven't listened to the entire podcast, but it's one of the few that I think I did reasonably well. But in that podcast, and the podcast he did with Melanie Joy, an amazing animal rights activist, who is interviewed and discusses with Ezra this concept of the green pill, you find out that the thing that scared Ezra most, and all the extremely difficult and brave reporting he's done for the last 20 years, the thing that scared him most is writing about and talking about animal rights. So why are we all so scared? So I think the primary reason we're scared is not just social disapproval, although that's part of it, right? Because if it were really social disapproval, I mean, the reality is, for all of the hate that vegans get, it's actually not that hard. Most people kind of think you're better than them if you're vegan. Let's get real. Most people think being vegan is the better thing to do, and they kind of agree that, yeah, I probably should be vegan too, right? And most people, if you talk about animals, and especially if you don't talk about veganism, you just talk about how you care about animals, who gets criticized for saying, I don't want animals to be scalded alive. I don't want animals to be shot in the face and killed. I don't want animals to be eviscerated alive with a slaughter line. All things that happen all the time, all over the world. So saying that you're not supportive of those things isn't so much that people actually disapprove. I think the thing that leads us to falsify our preferences and not speak our truth is first and foremost that we don't have hope. That if we thought about these things all the time, and this is what Ezra says, that when you take the green pill and you start looking around you and you start realizing there's violence, not just violence, nightmarish, brutal, tortuous violence everywhere, and the world suddenly becomes a very dark place. And if you think that there's nothing that can be done about that, if you think, and to a certain extent, it's not an unreasonable belief, given that human beings have spent tens of thousands of years torturing animals. If you think that this torture will continue indefinitely, then you can't believe that these things are wrong openly. You can't believe that animals have rights, because if you do, suddenly you're in the worst dystopian horror movie in the history of the planet Earth, and you can't get out. And I think that's what scares us more than anything else. It's probably the thing that scared me more than anything else. But here is the thing, and this is the magic of direct action everywhere. It's a magic that I have learned in Open Rescue and all the activism I've done. It's the reason I'm a much happier person, despite the fact that I've been jailed, I've been beaten, I've been deported, I've been prosecuted by my own government, I've been attacked as being a terrorist. I'm actually a happier person today than I was 20 years ago. And despite the fact that all these things have happened to me, and despite the fact that I know that living beings, including my own little guy, Oliver, living beings just like Oliver, are moments away from being tortured in ways that are unfathomable. Oliver himself was just a couple of weeks from being beaten across the face until he fell unconscious and having his throat slit so someone could eat his body. He's a little dog who was trapped in a dog meat farm. The thing that has allowed me to not just be happy, but effective at creating change is that I found not just a way to hope, but to believe to the deepest grain of my body, the finest, every grain of my body, believe that animal rights is not just something we can hope for. It's that animal rights is inevitable. And I've written quite a bit about why this is the case. But I'll point to two factors. One is institutional change, right? Why do I believe that animal rights is inevitable? Why am I so confident in this movement? The first is institutional change. And the reason institutional change is important, let me just define institutional change first. When you think about change, you can think about personal change, which is, someone going vegan or deciding they don't want to wear fur or becoming an activist. And that's fine and good and great. I'm glad people do it. I'm glad, you're doing it if you're doing it. And whatever personal changes you're making, you should be proud of yourself. I'm very supportive, whatever you are on that journey. But if you look at kind of what actually changes outcomes for people who are suffering and animals who are being tortured, it's mostly institutions. And institutions, broadly speaking, are the political science definition of an institution is actually just a set of rules, right? And every formal institution, a corporation, a government, a university, is essentially a set of rules, a set of documents that govern the way we interact with each other, right? It's a set of norms. And institutions are incredibly important because human beings are social animals, and most of what we do is not just based on our individual behavior and beliefs, it's based on our social norms. It's based on our social projects, the things we do together with others on a scale of hundreds or thousands or even billions of human beings across the face of the planet Earth. And when you can change institutions, you can change the world. And what we are seeing for the first time in animal rights history is massive institutional change and openness to change. If you had told me 10 years ago that there would be an Impossible Burger in every Burger King, I would have laughed at you. If you had told me that 20 years ago, when I was eating lima beans out of a can and dreaming of a day when I might be able to have vegan chocolate, that there would be vegan ice cream in every Safeway, I would have laughed you out of the room. And yet today, those things are all true. And even more important than the dietary institutions that have shifted, and there is massively increasing dietary institutional openness to plant-based living, is political openness. One of the most important Supreme Court cases and one of the most widely reported Supreme Court cases of the last couple of years was a Supreme Court case involving Prop 12, a ballot initiative to ban gestation crates and battery cages and veal crates in the state of California, but also to ban the sale of products that came from these abusive sources. And this case got a lot of attention and got up to the Supreme Court because, again, Joe Biden said for some bizarre reason that the state had no legitimate interest in keeping mother pigs out of crates. But the case won. The animal rights side won that case. And interestingly, in I believe it was a 6-3 decision. I'm trying to remember. Was it 6-3 or 5-4? Forgetting. I'm not a very good lawyer. What I do know is that the majority opinion was written by one of the most conservative justices in the Supreme Court, Justice Neil Gorsuch. And Neil Gorsuch does not just say that states have the right to regulate their products, which they do, that states have a legitimate interest in stopping cruelty to animals, which they do. Neil Gorsuch also writes in that opinion about the conspiracy and corruption to hide animal abuse. Go read the opinion yourself. And there's an interesting point where he discusses why are all these pork lobbyists and pork lawyers, like it's funny because pork is literally the subject of this case, but it's also metaphorically, you talk about, pork and all the pork and politics, pork barrel politics. It's all about, trading and corruption and conspiracies. But Gorsuch, in this opinion, asked the question why the pork industry brought this litigation instead of trying to convince ordinary consumers and voters that gestation crates aren't bad. Instead of trying to convince our elected representatives and state or federal legislatures that gestation crates aren't bad. Instead, they come to the court, and there's a reason for that. And that reason is corruption, the conspiracy to disguise and distort actual public sentiments to prevent animals from being protected. And when even Neil Gorsuch, the Supreme Court justice, who's probably the most conservative and pro-corporate Supreme Court justice sitting on the bench today, is saying that this industry is corrupt, that shows institutions are shifting away from animal abuse. Okay. So that's reason number one. I think we should be confident. But reason number two is even more important. And reason number two is growing political movements. You're seeing ballot initiatives to ban slaughterhouses in Denver, ban factory farms in Sonoma County, to remove the animal cruelty exemption in the state of Oregon. There is so much political activity on animal rights, so much grassroots activism. The last 10 years of my life, I have seen and been a part of and observed and experienced more grassroots political agitation and activism than I did in the last 15 years combined. I'm not doing a very good job recording this podcast. But the point is, if you look at social movements and what actually causes change, the primary driver of change isn't money, it's not consumption, and it's not actually fundamentally institutions. It's something that comes even before institutions, which is social movements. If you can get a sustained critical mass of people to agitate on behalf of some cause, you can change the world. Erica Chenoweth at Harvard's political science department showed this in an exhaustive empirical study. And that's why when I started Direct Action Everywhere, along with Priya Sahani and Ronnie Rose and a number of other people, we had a motto that basically explained our entire theory of change, and that explains to you why you should stop falsifying your preferences and how you can become a more influential person for animals and, frankly, beyond animals in your own life, and those 10 words were: find your voice, find some friends, and fight like hell. Let me just explain these 10 words. Find your voice. It is often said that the animal rights movement cannot ask for what we truly believe, that if we ask for animal liberation, for every cage to be empty, for every animal to be free, people will laugh us out of the room. This is incorrect. This is blatantly wrong. And social movements, through time immemorial, have found strength in their vision, that having a big vision is not a weakness. It is our greatest strength as a movement. Because if you don't have a big vision, you cannot inspire people to take part in your movement, right? So when the gay rights movement was just saying, well, can you not send us to insane asylums? That wasn't very inspiring. When the civil rights movement said, I guess racism is okay, but can you improve our schools a little bit? It was an inspiring movement. It was when activists said, you and I need to respect the rights of gay people to marry, that their love is just as sacred as ours. That's what inspired the public. When the civil rights movement said, separate is not equal, we have just as much of a right to go into that school, to sit in that bus, to be at that lunch counter as you do, and that there's no difference between human beings based on the color of their skin that is morally or politically relevant at all. That is what inspired a movement. And so a huge part of what will allow us collectively and individually to become more powerful and influential and ensure this conspiracy is dispelled and people in powerful positions and people in non-powerful positions finally start talking about this issue, finally stop lying to themselves about what's happening to animals, is for all of us to find our voice, to speak openly and proudly and loudly that we too believe in animal rights. But you might say, well, no, but when I say that, everyone just thinks I'm crazy, right? A lot of us have had this experience. Certainly I've had this experience. So this is part 2. Find some friends. It's not enough to find your voice. You've got to find other people who share that conviction and, importantly, also share your willingness to speak about it. And if you can connect with them, then suddenly you can create this sort of critical mass, a sort of social network that can snowball and create more power for the social change the animals need. And the scholar who researched this and changed, honestly, my view of almost everything is someone at the University of Pennsylvania named Duncan Watts. He has a very famous paper. And actually, I'm forgetting the name of the paper. Small World Networks, what's it called? I think it's called Collective Dynamics of Small World Networks in Nature. It's published in 1998. It's among the most cited papers in the history of social science. There are not a lot of social science papers that end up in Nature, which is, one of the 2 most prominent publications in the sciences. But the reason this paper ended up in Nature was because he discovered something incredibly powerful, which is that networks of people, connections between people, often have power that far exceeds the sum of their individual parts. That there's something about people coming together, and especially people coming together in random ways. The randomization of the connection was actually a big part of his model of social networks and social change. When people come together, it turns out they can do things that no one thought were possible. And this is something Margaret Mead believed too, right? She has that famous quote that, never doubt, let me just get the quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. Right? But the important thing is they have to come together. You've got to find some friends. And the last 4 words, and fight like hell. And I always say there's 2 aspects to this that will help you understand how you individually and we collectively can stop falsifying our preferences and start speaking more openly about the atrocities that are happening to animals. And those 2 parts are, 1, speaking alone or together with our friends on an issue that has so much entrenched history and tradition is going to be a fight. And that means two things. One is it's going to require sacrifice. You don't use the word fight unless there's some cost, right? And one of the things we have to recognize is, yes, we have to find our voice. And yes, we have to find some friends. And yes, in the long term, it's going to be beautiful for us and for the animals. But that will come at some cost. And if you're not willing to sacrifice, you're not going to create any change, right? This is Frederick Douglass, the famous anti-slavery activist. You say there's no rain without thunder. You need the thunder, right? But the other aspect of a fight that's important is a fight includes adversaries. And I'm not saying our adversaries are bad people. I don't think anyone, even those who directly slaughter animals, is a bad person. But what it does mean is that the playing field is dynamic. There are people who are going to actively try and undermine our efforts to find our voice, find some friends, and fight like hell. Because that, after all, is the nature of a fight. It is a two-way street, and sometimes it's more than two parties. But there are parties on the other side. And understanding that we're going to sacrifice, and we have to be strategic and dynamic and adapting to the fact that there are people who are trying to stop us, there are corporations that are trying to stop us, is very important to sustaining our ability to speak out over the long term. So yeah, there you have it. Find your voice, find some friends, and fight like hell. And if you do those 10 words, if we do those 10 words, then not just we as individuals, but our society collectively will stop lying about what's happened to animals. We'll stop pretending there's not a slaughterhouse in Chicago where little babies are having their blood drained from them, their throats slit, and a system as vile as the worst conspiracy theories about satanic rituals. The animals will finally be free. Okay. Yeah, sorry this is a different sort of conversation and podcast. I know y'all are probably used to me talking to other people. We're trying something new partly because, frankly, the conversations just haven't been doing that well. Probably because I'm not a very good host. But partly because I think we want this podcast and YouTube show to be a little more focused on things that matter. And I think there's very little that matters more right now than understanding why it is that so many people, including you and I, but also including the most powerful people in the world, like Joe Biden and Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, are conspiring to cover up these vile, evil, satanic rituals of violence that we call animal agriculture. And I hope that this conversation, and it is a conversation because I want you to comment, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on all this, helps you understand that and helps you in your personal journey. So hit that subscribe button and make sure you leave a comment as well, because I'd love to hear your thoughts about this discussion. And stay tuned for a lot more, because this is going to be the first of many shows. It's going to be a little different than I think the ones we've published before. All right, until next time. We don't have to hurt animals. You can protect them. We don't have to kill them. We can care for them. And that's who we're meant to be, right? That's who we are when we're at our best. We're caring for each other and for the other living beings of this earth and not hurting them.